All right, welcome to another episode of Safer Communities Canada. We are really excited to have a special guest in the house today, Dr. Irvin Waller. I'm going to start out by reading a snapshot of his extensive, amazing work in the community safety space and then delve right into it. So Dr. Irvin Waller is the Professor Emeritus of Criminology, University of Ottawa, and has been in this game in the community safety space since 1996. His latest book, Science and Secrets of Ending Violent Crime, published in 2019. We got it right here. We just had the honor of getting our copy signed. Explains how Canada, Mexico, United Kingdom, USA, and other countries can reduce violent crime by 50% in the next 5 years. His PhD at Cambridge University focused on the ineffectiveness of prisons and parole in Canada. He pioneered the first research on victims and prevention in Canada, became the Director General of Research in the Solicitors General, now Public Safety Canada, back in 1974, and worked on policing, death penalty, dangerous offenders, violence against women, victim rights, and gun control. I mean, we're in 2024, and I feel like we're talking about many of the same issues. So it's really good to have your expertise and historical perspective when we have the conversation today. And, he's been at University of Ottawa as of 1980 until he became a full professor in 1982. In 1985, Dr. Waller received multiple awards internationally, recognizing his instrumental work to get the UN General Assembly to establish the basic principles of justice for victims. And this Victim Magna Carta continues to improve victims' rights in countries across the world. And since then, he's advised more than 50 governments in Canada and abroad, including serving on commissions in Canada, South Africa under Mandela's government, United Kingdom, and USA. And we highly encourage you to check him out on his YouTube channel and follow him on Twitter at Irvin Waller and his personal website, www.irvinwaller.org. Thanks for making some time to visit us here in Jane and Finch today.
My pleasure.
Me and my co-host, Mr. Devon Jones, we're kind of going to post some questions to engage in some dialogue. It's been an honor to meet you. I know we reached out online, met on so many different calls, and here we are today actually for the first time meeting in person myself. And you met in person before?
No, I think we just
online on
met
some
online,
events.
yeah.
So, I mean, it's a beautiful thing. Like after COVID, it's a little bit weird to meet people in person, but we're getting back to it and we appreciate it. So we always start out by just humanizing our guests. You've been doing this since 1996, so we really salute you. Give us a little bit about how the young Irvin Waller got into this topic and the areas that you've really invested your whole life to advocating for, making systems better in community safety.
So I was born in the UK, and at the age of 17, I went on a freighter from London to East Coast of the United States, across to Australia and back. And the first thing was to see United States cities where you have guards on banks and you clearly have ghettos. When we first were going to go ashore, seamen are pretty tough people. We had to go in groups of 4 to go through one of the very poor areas of Philadelphia. While I was on that ship, I was a victim of an attempted murder, and on a separate occasion, I had the person who sat next to me at meals murder the person across from him. Wow. So I was going up to Cambridge to become a nuclear scientist or something like that, and that no longer made sense. So I shifted into economics because you couldn't actually go into criminology, and then I did a criminology degree at Cambridge, which was all about policy. And I was hired to come to Toronto, 1966, and work on a big Ford Foundation research project on the effectiveness of the prison and parole system. And basically, you can't teach people in the submarine to live in the real world, particularly when they have been had so many adverse experiences before they go into the submarine, into the prison. So I then did some stuff about, the public wants punishment. Some people in the public want punishment, But most of them want this stuff stopped. And if it's not stopped, many of them want restitution. So that was my second book. And then, as you've said, I worked for the federal government on really major files, major shifts, abolish the death penalty in Canada and gun control and violence against women and policing. And then I moved to the University of Ottawa, and which had a great program to teach people to be good at being parole and probation supervisors. And that isn't the answer. It's too late. They can't really make a difference. And I got involved with the U.S. victim movement, and hence the General Assembly resolution, which actually has in the resolution prevention. The actual principles are just about how you respond to victims, including restitution. And I moved on from that to prevention, because you get invited to strange corners of the world and you talk about victims, and then the minister says, well, shouldn't we actually be doing something to stop this? And so, and I got to know a key guy in the French National Assembly, the Speaker of the French National Assembly. Didn't speak any English. He had political power. And if you like, I had the ability to write and knowledge, and I could speak fluent French. So we became partners, and I started with this International Center on Prevention of Crime, affiliated with the UN, and the rest is history. But what drives me more than anything else is actually stopping victimization. And if you stop victimization, you empty prisons. You only have to look at the Netherlands, or you can look now at New York State, Connecticut, but you can't look at Canada. We are not doing the things that will actually stop crime. We, for more than 20 years, have increased police budgets. I call it compound increases. It's 2%, 3%, occasionally 8 or 10%. And all we're doing is paying the individual police officer more, and the individual police officer or the whole police system is after the fact. Once the crime's occurred, you bring them in to try and stop that particular violence continuing, but it's pretty rare they get there in time. And their job is to try and catch, convict, and ultimately incarcerate. That is not the way you're going to make Canada a model for safer streets, safer schools, safer homes.
I love that. That's beautiful. And, it speaks to the power of investing in prevention versus intervention or after the fact. I'll pass it on to Dee for the next question.
Yeah, Dr. Waller, when I came across your book, it completely resonated with me. The fact is that gun violence is a very personal mandate of mine, based on the number of students that I've lost over the years due to gun violence, and also were convicted of murder for perpetration of gun violence. We're dealing with the unfortunate reality of reciprocal violence, or get back killings. You kill my friend, so I'm gonna get you back, and just an unfortunate pattern that has continued and has pretty much spawned a subculture and a reality of its own. In reading your book, you mentioned a number of strategies that you would employ, that you have employed, or models that you have seen, including the Glasgow model. As it relates to dealing with this phenomenon of get back violence and that disproportionately impact Black communities, I'll give you some stats. Black folks make up 4% of the population federally, but we're responsible for 15% of victimization. Provincially, we're 5% of the population, but 25% of homicide victimization. What would be the most effective strategy? And I like the number, reducing violence by 50%. Of all the strategies that you've come across and that you speak about in your book, what would be the most effective strategy to reduce gun violence, victimization, perpetration, the disproportionality amongst Black communities, the culture of get back killings by 50% in the next few years? What is the best approach in your professional opinion?
We have to start by, I would say, educating the political elite, the people who actually stand for office, their advisors, and the senior ministers who advise them if they get into office. We have to persuade them that stopping people from being killed and injured and traumatized, those are three different things, is an important objective. And we have to persuade them that they can get elected doing that. And there are the Mayor of London, Mandela, Blair in England. There are a number of people who are elected on a tough on crime, tough on causes mandate. And I think in Canada, we need to go straight for smart on crime. So we have to get them to understand that by some relatively small investment, but sustained investment, and by small, I mean something of the equivalent of 5 to 10% of what we spend on reaction, that if they invest that smartly, then they can save the lives that you've talked about. And yes, stop perpetrators going to prison where it's not actually going to help them in any way or help the wider community. Now, that probably wasn't the answer you wanted, but that's my main answer. So what are the things that will actually achieve that? We have to develop a cohort of smart community safety planners, people working in Toronto City Hall or in North York or in Montreal or Vancouver or name your city, who actually know about the things that have stopped violence and know how to do the analysis so that you know where to put those programs in place. And I'm glad you mentioned Glasgow, because Glasgow did that. They had two people, a senior police officer and a public health specialist, somebody who actually knew how to do the diagnosis, and they did it. And yeah, it's interesting. In Glasgow, they were all white guys knifing white guys, but they were all poor with little opportunity of actually progressing. So just bring that to Jane Finch or bring that to racialized communities in Toronto or in Canada. Now, the list of things that you would put in place, or in my view, you would have as a shopping list for the city council and the province, and maybe the federal government, but both the province and city council to look at, would include outreach to young men. This was used in Glasgow, and I think you're doing some of this here in Jane Finch. So you take a street worker who can build the trust of young men who are likely to engage in violence, and I'll come back to that group in a moment, and outreach to them and help mentor them, help get them in complete school, maybe get job training, support them when they actually try and get jobs, because they may not be too good at actually keeping those jobs. But if they've got a mentor there, they can often keep the jobs for longer. That's actually at the top of my list. My second one is something like Thrive, where you have a trusted social worker who goes into a hospital emergency room when you have a victim of violence, be it a victim of knives or guns, and this person isn't dying, but they're seriously hurt. And while the surgeons are sewing them up, you say, do you really want to go through this again? And they say, yes, I want to get the guy. And then you talk them around to realizing that that isn't actually going to get them what they want. So you deal with their anger and you help them get into the sorts of things that an outreach worker would do. A third on my list is a program called Stop Now and Plan, which is most proven before young men reach age 12, but they also do it between 12 and 16. And this is getting at exactly what you said. So the killing is very emotional. This is not somebody planning to steal a Range Rover. This is somebody trying to get back at somebody who's got them really angry. It's very emotional. They often don't plan it very well. And so, helping them deal with that anger. And this is all of these programs that I've mentioned have, some of them have outreach is more than 50%, because they're relatively small groups you're working with who actually go into hospitals. But those are around 40 or 50%. SNAP is over 30%. And there are other things, creating jobs, creating a future for them. During COVID, we actually had CERB in this country, so you actually gave people a minimum income.
Yeah.
So we've got to be looking at all of those things. I would also say cautiously, there is a role for the police. They can refer people to these programs. I am a little bit careful about hotspot policing, because you just go after the black kid, the racialized kid more and more. I'm also cautious about focused deterrence, because it's the same thing. Okay, if the young man actually goes to these programs, great. But if he doesn't, you put him in prison, and prisons, you put somebody on ice, and they have so many problems before they even get there. And prisons aren't going to help them with these problems. So, maybe they come out aged a bit, but you really, all the money we put into trying to find a magical rehabilitation program doesn't begin to compare with the stuff that is before people actually commit the violence. And that's what's so important. I want to just talk about that small group. So people think, these dreamers, they want to eliminate poverty, they want to eliminate racism. Well, I'm a dreamer like that. But I'm not going to argue that as the way to stop violence in the next 2 or 3 years in Jane Finch or Montreal Nord, or choose the area you want to do. It's going to take a long time.
Yeah.
Just look at how long it took them to get childcare. So don't expect miracles there.
Yeah.
But if you, within the poor area, look at those who have the most adverse child experiences, and you don't actually need to go out there with a thermometer and measure them. You look at who is being rejected by the school system, by their mother, by the police, and you go out to them and you start working with them. And this might be 5% of the people living in a disadvantaged area. And it's not exactly 5% if you happen to take 10% of them. But within that group, you can turn them around enough to see a 50% reduction. Just think of 50% fewer lives lost at a time when homicides are going up, particularly gun violence homicides in Canada. And think what it means in terms of these folk not only engaging in violence, but beginning to contribute and have a life to live, of knowing more about how to establish a relationship with a partner. Partners are really important to keeping people out of trouble. A partner with your kid is even better. So, but all that takes work, and it takes sustained funding. I'm fed up with little projects from the federal government, and they're good projects. You reach 50 kids for 3 years, and then there's no future. You have to reach 1,000 kids for much more than 3 years. And we can do that. And we need folk like you to get out to those politicians. And I think actually, whether in the left or the right or in the center, they all want to stop violence. Some will be hard to give up prisons, but you can allow them to have police in prisons as long as they put a adequate amount of money, as I say, the equivalent of 10%, into the things that will actually save lives, stop injuries, and reduce trauma.
Oh, thank you. That was very insightful. I mean, you covered so much ground. I mean, I'm reminded of, the term harm reduction, to your point. When we want to reduce or mitigate something, it's not going to happen overnight because it's rooted in a lot of systemic issues. And, you mentioned a really good point around not just focusing on maybe perpetrators of crime, but the victims. And so you've done so much great work using this, victim-centered approach in creating safer communities. Tell us how it was like working on the international stage, at the UN General Assembly to establish this principles of justice for victims. And how do you see the focus on healing from trauma? I know, I didn't know about the traumatic experience you had, and you mentioned it earlier on. How important is it to support folks to overcome that? And when I think about the context of our community, and I know me and Devon have this conversation, like simply being exposed to violence, of homicide, of friends dying, that impacts the people and the children growing up in this community. So how do we help mitigate being victims or indirectly being exposed to that constant high level of violence to make sure their trajectory stays on a positive path?
So the U.S. National Organization of Victim Assistance in the early 80s invited me on their board. I'm the only foreign person they've had on their board, and I just learned so much. I think there were 3 guys, one black prosecutor, and another guy who I actually worked with on the UN Declaration. And the black prosecutor was against capital punishment. I was against capital punishment, and there was a third person against capital punishment. But the others were basically all women who'd been victims of domestic violence, of sexual assaults, rape, so on. But they were just... One of the wonderful things about the U.S. is they have this incredible energy to do things. And while I was there, they passed the Victim of Crime Act, which basically takes fines on offenders. These are actually billion-dollar fines because they're on people who cheat the Federal Drug Agency. And they use this money to set up compensation, to set up services, to do things, and so on. But they really inspired me. And during the time I worked for the federal government, I was their lead on stuff in the Council of Europe. So I already knew some of the progressive things going on, restorative justice, restitution. Yes. By the way, they were using documents from the Canadian Law Reform Commission to justify restitution. And we weren't even doing it. It had been invented here, translated into English and French, and they were doing it. So that's how I really got going. And when you're working at the UN every 5 years, they do a congress. There's one coming up, by the way, in 2026 that you guys should think about, where evidence-based crime prevention is very much on the agenda. Access to justice is very much on the agenda. So, I got invited by the NDP minister in Manitoba, by a right of centre minister in South Australia, and it just multiplied. And Japan probably has the lowest homicide rate in the world, lowest incarceration rate in the world, but it has the best victim assistance and compensation and restitution in the world. The victims actually have standing in court, which I'm an incredibly strong believer in. So, if you go into a North American or a British or a Canadian court, it's the Crown versus the suspects, and the victim is used by this system. And
that's very interesting.
Once you have a victim representative, as France has traditionally, I speak fluent French, I've lived and worked in France on their civil justice system, then people are motivated to try and deal with some sort of restorative restitution. And I don't want to exaggerate how effective that is, but it's a lot more effective than throwing somebody in jail who's made worse by that experience, and you don't exactly expect them to be able to pay all of their damages. But if they are actually doing something constructive, that's going in the right direction. Now, what I've done internationally is I like to go. So I go to Germany to do a speech. They get 5,000 people at a crime prevention conference in Germany.
Wow, that's big.
And I've done one translated from English to German, and I've done one in English, so they can now understand English enough, because the younger generation is getting there. And I'm looking for something they're doing that I can talk about when I go to Washington or Buenos Aires or whatever. So I think we're learning.
Yeah.
And the one you mentioned, Glasgow.
Yes.
So I've been on the edge of the World Health Organization, and they have Advanced Prevention Alliance that the emergency room doctor at St. Michael's was a member of. I'm not sure whether she was in Winnipeg at that time or anyhow. So it's a group of people who believe in the same thing as us, and happened to be in Liverpool. So there was a heavy focus on alcohol and poverty and blocked opportunity. And they had the guy from Bogota. And this guy worked for the mayor directly, and he was a public health guy, and they analyzed all the death records. Was the guy who did it drunk? Was the guy dead drunk? What time? Was a gun used, knife, whatever, and what time? And then they fed it back, and they put in place, they stopped alcohol during the high periods. I mean, you could still get alcohol, but you had to go out of your way to plan. They took guns away. They gave them sports shoes. I don't know whether that would work here, but it doesn't matter whether it would work here. They basically persuaded them to give up guns, and they did this stuff in emergency rooms. Now, the guy from Glasgow, a senior detective, so you got to think, is there somebody at the top level of the Toronto police who actually wants to reduce violence in Toronto? And he might be black, he might not be black, but he has to want to stop it. And this guy, Carnochan, who you wouldn't be able to understand, he's from the poor areas of Glasgow, and I could hear him say, "Aha," in a heavy Scottish accent. And he went home and he hired a public health person. They did the analysis, and the rest is history. And that's what we need here. We need somebody who has the guts to talk to the public health person in Toronto.
Yep.
And whether it's her or somebody else, but they need somebody who can do that diagnosis so that it isn't just police data. People don't know, but hospital have much better data than police, because not all the victims, about 2/3 of the victims, don't go to the police. I mean, if you got a dead body, that's different. But everybody who's seriously injured goes to a hospital emergency room. So we should be getting data from there, and we should be measuring whether what we're doing actually reduces the numbers of injured people. You can measure injuries. Trauma, it's a bit harder, but you can measure injuries. Now, Glasgow, 10 years it took them, but now they are cloning Glasgow across the whole of the UK. So you could go to London, or you could bring them in on a Zoom call, and the mayor has a high-level office headed by actually a female councillor, and they're not doing as much as I want, but they're doing things to scale, mentoring being one of them, outreach, things like Thrive in hospitals. And this is spreading across the UK. I happen to like the Manchester one, and you're getting a 25% reduction. Could they do better? Yes, they can do
That's a
better.
good start.
But hey, if we could get a sustained 25% reduction in police data and in lives lost and injuries, that would be good.
Oh, awesome.
That's incredible. As it relates to an effective strategy and dealing with the dynamic, because for us, we're dealing with this evolving and escalating phenomenon that's always changing. And with each homicide, it changes. So with each homicide, this phenomenon becomes way more complicated. That's someone else that you're walking off a ledge. That's someone's brother or cousin who we have to engage in conversations around not being retaliatory. Similar to we work with Towards Peace that has a similar component. They're in community. They do person to person, and they also employ the piece around visiting those who've been victimized. I think where the model fails is, or the model is a little bit compromised, is the fact that we're not in an institution connecting with those who are perpetrators. Is that an approach that you think is effective or has some efficacy to it? What is the best approach? What is the best approach to engage those who are the core of this subculture of violence?
And sometimes you use that term, violence producers, right?
Yes. Yeah.
So we spend somewhere between $500,000 and $1 million investigating that shooting.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't always catch the guy.
Mm.
So think about that. Just think what you could do with $500,000.
Mm-hmm.
Let's not exaggerate. But this is in my view, this is stupid. So 100 years ago, it may have made sense to only try and catch the guy and punish him.
Mm-hmm.
This is 2024. We have 50 years of scientific knowledge about what works.
Mm-hmm.
And we can be smart. And by being smart, so most people want that guy caught, the perpetrator. I'm not going to argue about that. But when you're doing a pre-sentence report, that's on top of what it costs to catch him.
Mm-hmm.
We need to spend the same amount of money. So every time there's a murder, we should make sure that there's $1 million to investigate why that happened. Not why this one guy can be proven to have done what he did, but what was the background to it?
Mm-hmm.
What led up to this? What was the history? And the police do this a little bit because they have to identify a person, and they often can't get witnesses to work with them. But this is not police work. You have to have somebody who's dedicated to looking at, well, what was the history of this perpetrator, whatever you said, violence producer?
Yeah.
What was the history of the person who got killed or seriously injured or traumatized? What was going on in that community? And turning this into a solvable problem. So you talk about Glasgow, and it's not just because I'm born in England. I can tell you everything that they're doing that's wrong. But there's a thing called the Cardiff model that was also used in Glasgow.
Mm-hmm.
So when somebody comes to an emergency room, you don't just have a youth outreach worker or an outreach worker. You actually have somebody doing the epidemiology. Mm-hmm. COVID, we can now pronounce epidemiology sometimes.
Yeah.
And what epidemiology means is you're looking at the context, you're looking at the patterns. And, the police can show you where the shootings took place, but they can't show you where the fights took place that led to this.
Mm-hmm.
But you have to somehow start getting at the history. And they did that in Glasgow. I'm not sure if you've ever seen, so Dale McPhee, who was very much an inventor of situational tables and was a deputy minister in Saskatchewan, and he was president of the Canadian Chiefs of Police. He took a group from the Education Ministry, from social services, from the municipalities to Glasgow. And I used to have him doing lectures for me where he would show them movies. And then their movies showed you where the perpetrators and the victims came from, who was their mother, who was their grandmother, because often the mother wasn't around, whether they'd ever held jobs. And once you saw this, you realized that arresting these guys, if you can convict them, which it's actually easier to convict them in Glasgow because you have closed-circuit television and you have lots of witnesses when people are knifing because it's in entertainment districts. It's much harder here where they tend not to, even with cell phones and stuff. But once you begin to look at that, you can then turn it into, we live in a province that since 2019 has changed its police act. It didn't say stop policing. It said start community safety planning. And that act, Section 251, is fantastic for me. I wish people would just do it. It says identify problems like crime, victimization, drug addiction. You can identify other problems like homelessness or mental illness if you want to, or trauma. But you have to include those ones that are, for me, the obvious ones, because they're what scare people. And so you have to then look at, well, what are the risk factors? They didn't say, was it poverty? Risk factors. So something reasonably short term. And then you have to have a strategy. And my book in section 2 comes up with strategies. And if you don't want to believe me, just look at the UK that's spending $350 million putting out the same programs that I identified in my book. I can't accuse them of plagiarism, but hey, they've got a lot of money to put this out. We don't have anything like that. There's my book, and I don't know what the other ones are here. But we need to be looking at those things that have been proven to work. And we need to, once we've done this diagnosis, there's this group in this particular area who we need to focus on. They seem to be drifting into violence, or already their family or the school or somebody's complaining about them being involved in violence. And we need to use the things that work, and we can change them. We can change them. We can give them a future. If you want to give enough people a future so that you reduce violence across the city by 50%, then you have to have a budget to do that.
Yeah. And
the budget to do that, in my view, is 10% of what the city's spending on policing.
Yeah.
But
and incarceration.
But policing is the big cost in Canada. And great. I'm not going to argue and put both there. Now, the city has an interest, because if you don't stop violence, you will never be able to stop the growing police budget. You have to stop violence because that's how they justify increases. So you have to stop the violence. The city needs to keep... we don't want Toronto to become the next Detroit, where in order for their homicide rate to stay at 50 per 100,000, they had to reduce the population by half. We do not want... People want to live downtown Toronto because it's safe. And if you want investment there, you want people to live there, you want house values to stay, then you have to invest in things that work and not just expensive Band-Aids that respond to the problem and do not make it significantly better.
Yeah, I mean, well said.
Yeah. Irvin, youth violence perpetration nationally, according to census Canada went from 31 in 2021 to 90 in 2022. What would you attribute this rise in perpetration to? What do you think are some of the factors contributing to this rise?
And it was youth who were charged with homicide.
Yeah.
So we're talking about a very high level of violence, not like a regular acts of violence.
Yeah, 17 and they're under 18.
Yeah.
Well, the first thing is that street violence went down during COVID. There's a general assumption that domestic violence went up, but street violence went down. In the US, street violent homicide went up by 30%.
During COVID?
During COVID.
Wow.
Very different from us. And now people are saying, oh, well, violent crime is coming down in the US. Well, violent crime coming down in Chicago means that the homicide rate is coming back to 8 times that of Toronto. And they have 2.5 times the number of cops we have. And they have an incarceration rate that is 6 times ours. Wow. So don't give me that
beautifully put into perspective. Yeah.
So I don't know why it's going up, but we stopped the minimal income. That's really important. We had people now going out more, and that includes people going out so they can get involved in conflict, because these outreach workers are not just reaching people to turn them around, they're also stopping conflicts. And we have been asleep at the wheel. We are not doing the things that have been proven to work with enough funding and enough support to really make a difference. Our homicide rates, fortunately, are not like those of Chicago or choose your New Orleans or Baltimore or
hopefully not.
Right, but I don't think they will do that, because we have a better social safety net, we have health care, but we look like complete dummies compared to the UK. And if you want to look like an ultimate dummy, just compare us with Japan or somewhere like that.
Yeah.
But we should be able to do as well as, choose your favorite West European country. We should be able to do as well as London or Glasgow, for that matter. And Toronto has a relatively high homicide rate compared to Montreal or Ottawa. But yeah, we look good compared to prairie cities where you're looking at poor Indigenous populations whose opportunities are blocked, and where the response is just policing. And, where people compete for the same dollar, and they're often doing exactly the right things, but they don't have the resources and the backup to do those. I mean, when you look at policing, and okay, it's an institution been around for a long time, so there's a civilian for every 2 officers. They think they don't have enough money, but they have a lot of money. They're very well paid. They're pensioned. It's a relatively safe job. I'm not saying that occasionally things don't go wrong. And then you look at somebody who's going to outreach to those same young men who might be using violence. And you see in the US that some of those outreach workers get shot. They get shot in crossfire. They don't. Sometimes they get killed. Sometimes they don't. We have to really make these jobs that really are capable of reducing violence on the street significantly. We need to give them the adequate security in the short and long term. We need to give them the training, the support, so that they can do their jobs. And yes, we need a a city hall that guides them. And I think Toronto has started on the right path, but we need to do this faster.
Yes.
Yeah,
agreed.
Yeah, the safe TO model being piloted by Scott McKean and his team. I think it's an incredible model and it's an incredible strategy.
And we had Scott on the show. He's going to be one of the episodes once we release it as well.
Yeah. And I mean, safe TO encompasses a number of different strategy, gender-based violence, domestic violence, et cetera. But there's a unique, nuanced phenomenon around what we're seeing, in particular, poor, Black, underserved, under-resourced communities. The disproportionality, the escalation, et cetera.
Well, I couldn't agree with you more. And I want to add one thing. If you look at police violence, so when somebody's arrested, people think, well, the guy just stands there and they put handcuffs on and he's, treated like a gentleman and put in the car and put in the cell. This isn't the reality, because many Black men are fearful of what the police do.
Yeah.
And because they're fearful, they resist, so they get more violence. And this is not neutral. So we can talk about the trauma because you have been shot or you have witnessed a shooting. People forget that witnessing a shooting can also lead to trauma. But an arrest, and you see this particularly when they make a mistake. And I don't know how they manage to make these mistakes, but then when they make these mistakes, then suddenly people realize, well, this U of T student shouldn't have been treated like this. What they forget is that U of T student wasn't really resisting. And if he had been resisting, he would have had an even more violent experience. And this is not good news. So I didn't say we don't want to hold people accountable for using guns, handguns. We do need to hold people accountable. We do need to do everything to stop that. But part of stopping that is getting upstream. And this upstream word, people say, well, you have to tackle the causes.
Yeah.
But, yes, but you have to be organized.
Yeah.
It has to be systematic, data-based to do it. The people who actually do the outreach have to be human beings, but the people who do the analysis have to be folk like me who are obsessed with numbers and doing it right and creating it. And those people exist in the public health world.
And I think you make a really good point of we need to invest as much, if not more, of what we put into the intervention in the prevention pot, which I don't think those numbers align, right? We think about the punitive discourse and the rise in the budgets. We got time for 2 more questions. So I'm going to take you to the futuristic vision because you told me you're a dreamer. So when you think about the future, and we think about so much has changed since COVID, in the last year or two, we see artificial intelligence coming in. I read an article the other day that talked about there might be a day where the courts are just run by AI and they might be more accurate than our current courts in terms of finding folks guilty or not guilty. So when you think about the future of crime prevention, what do you envision in terms of community safety strategies and new developments? And no parameters, dream big. Like, when I ask that, when you think of another way to ask that is when you think of a safe community, how does that world look like from the time the person wakes up to when they go to sleep?
Well, I like 2 words. I like ignite. So we have all this knowledge. We have people like you doing it. We need to clone it. So we and it's just a question of igniting it. We don't have to. We can learn from the US, UK, from Australia, wherever you want to learn from, but we have the people here. So ignite is important. I'm a fan of the Beatles and I love Imagine. So we have to imagine, and she talks, I'm sorry, he talks, but I actually have a female artist in my mind. So we have to imagine And we have to dream together. And what I want to see is Canada, who's so proud of safety. People come here from all over the world because they think Canada's safe.
Yeah.
It's not just that we have universal health care or something close to it. They think it's safe. And Toronto, they want to think it's safe. So we have to make it safe so that when people come from wherever they come, that we have one of the lowest rates of gender-based violence, of street violence, of violence in schools in the world. And we have the knowledge to do that, and we just have to ignite those politicians so that they decide that they want it too, and they have to imagine how they can shift to do it. And I don't actually want to fight. I don't want to advertise abolishing prisons or defunding police. You will get nowhere. Let the police and prisons do what they're doing, and let's hook our funding to what they're able to get. And over time, we're not going to need the same number of prisons. That's what we see in New York State and California, in the Netherlands. And we're not going to need the same number of police responding to 911 calls. We're not going to need the same number of detectives. I think already in Toronto, we've realized that there are better ways of dealing with mental health crises.
Yes.
Well, there are many better ways of dealing with stopping the people from being injured, traumatized, and killed, and making people feel safer in their where they live, in their homes and in schools and on the streets.
And that makes sense, and it's practical, because you're saying eventually, if the prevention is effective, there's a less load on having to intervene, and therefore you can reallocate those resources to upstream versus...
Well, I think that's the argument for government officials.
Yeah.
My argument is different. My argument is we want to live in a society where fewer people are killed, injured, or traumatized, or live in fear because of violent crime. And you can put the two together because you have to use this money argument with politicians because that's what they tend to understand.
Yes.
But I think the people voting for them understand the human realities.
The embodied experience.
And I want to see us talking much more about hospitals being the Band-Aid than police being the Band-Aid. Because I think we're going to get much better reception in hospitals because these are professionals.
Yeah.
They don't actually want more work. I'm not saying all police want more work, but I think we don't have enough police leaders in this country who are professionals who actually want to stop the violence rather than protect their budget or slowly increase their budget.
Yeah, in looking at, I mean, that's a very valid point. And looking at the piece around budget and policies, we're policy people, and we have some scathing concerns around, for example, Public Safety Canada and what's in their mandate letter versus what's in their departmental plan, for 2023, 2024, 2022, 2023. It doesn't speak to what we're seeing in community. It doesn't speak to this urgency. And if there isn't policy at the federal level driving the province and driving the city, how concerned should we be?
Well, I look at their targets. If you actually go on their website, they have a target of reducing violent crime. I don't think they have a target of reducing racial or black violent crime, but I think they have an Indigenous one. They never meet it. And I can tell you that people working in Statistics Canada who read my book, who know what works, and if you look at their projects are actually good. It's just they're short term and for 50 people. We absolutely have to get a deputy minister whose job is reducing victimization or violence prevention. I don't know what phrase they would want to use, or you can have violence prevention and victim rights or something like that. They have to have a deputy minister, the same as we have a commissioner of the RCMP and a commissioner of the Corrections
Love that.
Service.
Yeah.
And then things will happen, because then the minister will get briefed, and that person will say, look, minister, we're not meeting our targets. And those deputy ministers are scared of doing what's right, and they fail.
Yeah. I mean, banning handguns and cyberbullying is definitely not the approach. And we've reached out to the deputy minister, who is Sean Tupper, around addressing this issue, because, I mean, policy has to drive this urgency. Policy has to drive the strategy, and policy has to inform what's not taking. Policy has to drive safer communities, so we're just hoping to see some consistency between those mandate letters and what's actually taking place on authentic approaches, practical, tangible approaches that's effective and evidence-based.
So they have a review of their national crime prevention strategy, and it tells them in part what to do, but they don't do it. And I'm not saying to the minister that he should stop funding the RCMP or the Corrections Service or CBSA. I am saying that if he wants to stop violent crime, or the next government, when they come in, if they want to stop violent crime, then you have to have a deputy minister who's responsible for doing that, who actually prepares the budgets and the justifications to make it happen, and can work with the provinces. We have to get the provinces on board too.
Synergy.
And we actually see that happening. Even though Ontario changed the legislation, they haven't really put money into supporting these plans, let alone supporting the implementation. But because they don't have a high-level person, you have a deputy minister of policing and a deputy minister of prisons. You don't have a deputy minister of violence prevention, and that's what you need.
I mean, you have one of Public Safety Canada. There's a deputy minister of Public Safety Canada. So, I mean, if not his, then whose portfolio would this issue falls?
I worked in Public Safety Canada in a different era. That's a small group secretariat advising. They write speeches for the minister. And yes, they have at a low level some brilliant people. They have some brilliant published stuff that shows you what works and what they could do. And when they hand out $1 million there and $1 million here, those are good little projects. But a good little project isn't going to move the indicator on violent crime. And the only way to do that is to have somebody who is like a commissioner of the RCMP. You could have a commissioner of violence prevention and victim rights, something like that, and resourced, not with billions and billions of dollars, but with enough to be able to match and encourage the provinces to invest the money that they need to be investing. We have to move away from small, short-term projects to sustained projects that are adequately funded. And the planning thing, I do not understand why they haven't invested in planning. Planning is an accelerator. It costs money, but once you have worked in setting up some institutes to do the planning, they will be able to justify in Toronto or in Ontario or wherever in Canada the things that you need to do. That was the secret of Glasgow. That was the secret of Bogota. That's the secret of London. That's the secret of Manchester. Even the U.S. today. Even the U.S. Kamala Harris, Vice President of the United States, heads an office of gun violence prevention.
Yes.
Okay. And my God, that's just so obvious.
Yeah, and you sent me the link. I remember they had an event last month.
Okay, interesting.
Yes.
But I mean, on the positive note of all the cities that have turned it around, we hope Toronto continues on that path. I want to honor the words you said, imagine and ignite. We're grateful for you sharing your time, your expertise, being part of our coalition. as part of a Center for Community Safety and Roots of Violence at YAAACE, and bringing together, the term you used, bringing together the dreamers and the people from all walks of life and their expertise and lived experiences to continue to find solutions that are sustainable in the long run, because as you said, we need to resource this if it's going to be a long-term strategy to move the needle. So thank you so much for being here and for visiting us, and we hope to continue to work with you in many other capacities.
Thank you, Dr.
It's such a privilege to meet the people who are actually getting results. Less injuries, less trauma, less deaths, and less fear.
We appreciate you.
Thank
If you haven't read Dr. Waller's book, highly recommend you get it. Check out his website. It's a must read, and we hope to continue to apply the lessons he's sharing with us to community and what we do here in Toronto. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
All right.